Car makers are in the business of selling cars and fixing broken cars. A lot of services don't actually even make them a lot of money. I want to share some of these habits that will help you take your car to 500,000 miles with no major repairs. Let's get into it now. The first habit you've got to get into if you want to make your vehicle last 500,000 miles is changing your oil much more frequently. A lot of manufacturers are extending oil services now 10, 12, 15,000 miles with the hope that they sell you maintenance packages. You come in a year later and all they have to do is one oil change every year at the very most. But we all know if you're piling the miles on, you've got to change your oil. Dusty conditions, hard driving, high and low temperature conditions definitely means you're going to want to change it a lot sooner. And those 12,000 mile intervals is simply too long. Why is that? Well, you've got to check your oil regularly, but even checking in the owner's manual, a lot of times modern day cars now have long extended services. And why is that? Well, it's simply because they're trying to sell you these maintenance packages. But unfortunately, you're going to suffer the downfall because unfortunately 5 or 10 years later, once a warranty is long gone, all the damage is done. All the extra sludge, the wear, the tear is starting to take toll. It never happens in the first 2 to 3 years. It takes a period of time, and that's what's going to shorten up the life of your vehicle. Remember, a lot of modern day vehicles now have turbocharging. A lot of modern day vehicles have variable valve timing. Of course, also uses high pressure oil. A lot of them have all kinds of oiling for bearings, not just for the engine, but for the entire vehicle. A lot of times that oil is more important than you could possibly imagine. Even from vehicles from 10 or 15 years ago, vehicles need that oil, and they need quality oil to keep them alive. And so extending the oil service intervals just means you're introducing contaminants, wear and tear, and sludge to extra engine parts and auxiliary parts like turbo bearings, and means you're likely going to run that vehicle much, much shorter in terms of its lifespan. So you definitely want to do your oil changes at 5,000 to 8,000 miles at the very longest to make sure that you help extend the life of that engine. Another mistake a lot of drivers get into is over revving their cold engines. I mean, when you get into your car in the morning and you want to get going, nobody has the time. They want to get going to work. They don't want to be late. But to keep your engine RPMs down is the ultimate. Now, there's a few different groups of people. Some people believe that you've got to warm up your vehicle, let it warm up for 15 or 20 minutes to get the proper heating temperature, but it doesn't unfortunately work all that well because it doesn't introduce the heat throughout. Rather, it just overheats the heads, creates valve guide wear and other problems. Of course, there's the other camp of people that get in their vehicle, rev the heck out of it, and just go zooming off as soon as the vehicle's ready to go. That's also not good. But then there's those other people that are a little bit extra cautious. They take their time, they start the car, they let it rev, and they watch the RPMs drop. Now that's ideal, is let your vehicle start at high idles to about usually 1,200, 1,300 RPM, and then after about a minute or so, it'll drop and settle down to somewhere in that 800, 900 RPM. That's the sweet spot. Because after it finally does that gentle, soft roll down to below idle, it's almost ready to go. That said, that's a fairly good time to get setting off. However, you never rev the car hard, you never drive it under anger, and you always take a relaxed approach until the vehicle is up to its entire operating temperature. Another habit you've got to get into is wheel alignments. A lot of people neglect that. 15,000 miles, maybe once every 2 years, to actually look at your wheel alignment. Because if your wheel alignment's out, you wind up getting potentially some excessive wear on your tires. It could impose extra wear on your shocks, your struts, suspension parts, ball joints. And the worst part is, with a misaligned vehicle, you're going to have potentially spending way more money on repairs of some of those other auxiliary parts because the wheel alignment's out. So ultimately, you want to check your wheel alignment every year to every 2 years. 15,000 miles is best, and that gives you the best chance to extend and maximize the life of your tires, the shocks, the struts, the suspension parts. Otherwise, you could face serious, significant dollars, and as well, it's a potential safety concern if you're not taking care of your wheel alignment. So if you feel that your vehicle's pulling to one side, maybe under braking, or even just kind of veers off all the time, or there's a weird shimmy, always check your wheel alignment, always check the balance of your wheels and the general condition of the tires to make sure that you're getting the best, most life out of those vehicles. Brakes are one of the most important things on a vehicle. If you're driving along and you can't slow down, that is essentially the most hazardous conditions. And if you can't slow down and you can't stop on time for that traffic, you could end up crashing into somebody, taking out another vehicle, and of course that will naturally shorten the life of the vehicle. So naturally, we want to use that word over and over again because it should come to the back of your mind. It should come almost automatically that you're going to change your brake fluid. So in this case, we have brake fluid, and you want to do a proper brake fluid flush every 2 to 3 years as a bare minimum, because as you neglect that brake fluid, what you end up with is excessive amounts of water and moisture in your brakes. That moisture creates a very spongy condition on your brake pedals, and unfortunately reduces the braking capacity and the power and performance of those brakes. If you have a reduced braking capacity, well, that's just a recipe for disaster. So you always want to check to make sure you're using the right grade, .3, .4, whatever that brake fluid is. Do a proper flush, and when you're doing a flush, you always work your way from the back. So if your master cylinder is here, you start at the back, flush that corner, you work to this corner, you work to that corner, and then you finally end up at the closest wheel to the brake master cylinder, and you start in one corner and work your way all the way around. It's a relatively easy DIY, can save you a lot of money in the long run, and as well, it's a serious safety improvement. Another item that a lot of people neglect is the fuel system. I mean, we take it for granted. We turn the key, the vehicle starts and runs. But have you ever had a condition where you put your foot to the throttle and maybe there's a hesitation, or it's not running all that well, or maybe your fuel economy is going out the window? What do you think that could be from? Well, there's one aspect that a lot of people forget, and it's a habit you should get into, about changing your fuel filter. Now, a lot of these vehicles have direct fuel injection. There's a low pressure pump, high pressure injectors and pumps. A lot of equipment, lots of fuel systems to go through, and of course, to create that right atomization and the right fueling into the engine to get the optimal performance for both speed, performance, power, as well as fuel efficiency, you've got to make sure that you don't have restrictions in the fuel system. So ultimately, what you want to do is change the fuel filter. Now, that is something that you can likely do as per manufacturer's instructions. Some of them are mounted in around the tank, some of them are in line underneath the vehicle, some of them are under the hood, and it depends on the vehicle, but something you need to look into. Check your owner's manual for that particular issue and see what they suggest. But ultimately, never skip your fuel filter changes, otherwise you could find a massive deterioration in the vehicle. And if you do that running lean, it may cause other problems with the engine. Of course, ultimately, worst case scenario, shortening life, because it could create detonation and other failures within the engine indirectly because of poor fueling or even uneven fueling to the engine. Now, this car has a PCV, a positive crankcase ventilation valve. Virtually every car these days does, because it takes waste fueling, in other words, the gases, and it puts it back into the intake manifold through a set of valving, and ultimately improves the fuel efficiency and reduces the emissions of a lot of those gases, the waste gases that you find in the crankcase, puts it back into the intake and just cleans the air in general. Now, if that's not functioning properly, you could have other major engine failures. It could create oil leaks, could create oil contaminations, failures, rough running, stalling, and believe it or not, a catastrophic engine failures. So changing your PCV is an absolute critical step that a lot of people forget. Some cars, it's an easy part. It's $39 in some cars. In other cars, like this Mercedes-Benz, has this really interesting set of PCV controls and hosing and all kinds of technical mumbo jumbo that ultimately means to do a replacement could cost in that $3,000 to $4,000 parts and labor installed, hence the three-pointed star. But nonetheless, a PCV, especially one that's smaller and more economical and designed to replace, should be serviced and should be replaced at the respective intervals. The mass airflow sensor is another sensor you need to inspect regularly and clean if needed. Now, the mass airflow sensor usually comes in, you've got your intake system, of course you've got to go through the air filter, and then downstream of your air filter usually is the mass airflow sensor tucked in there. Now, quite often that is a serviceable part. You should be very sensitive to it and know that it's got fragile parts. The hot wires in there are fragile, and you've got to be very delicate and dainty with it, but ultimately it's worth an inspection and a possible cleaning, because a mass airflow sensor that's not working right can create excess poor running conditions, fueling, overfueling, underfueling, odd idle, and other conditions that mean you're not going to get the maximum efficiency. It ultimately means poor fuel economy, worse running conditions, and of course, Generally, when you have a vehicle that's running rough or not running properly or too lean or too fuel or too rich, that could and likely will shorten the life of that engine. You want that working right? Check your mass airflow, at least inspect it and make sure it's running properly. Not every problem with the mass airflow sensor shows up as a check engine light, so it's definitely something you want to inspect somewhat regularly. Coolant in the modern day vehicles is a very, very important lifeblood of the vehicle. Of course, coolant doesn't just keep the engine cool anymore, it actually does other features like cools turbochargers and generally keeps the operating health of the vehicle at its top. Neglecting coolant, unfortunately, can result in a lot of problems. Of course, whether the fluid's low, you could create an overheating conditions, blown head gaskets. If you ever see white exhaust smoke coming out of the tailpipe, that could be a sign that you have a burnt head gasket. But ultimately, to keep your cooling proper, you've got radiators, you've got water pumps, thermostats, a whole host of different cooling lines and fittings, and neglecting your cooling system can result in extra material building up, extra corrosion, extra caking, and ultimately can lead to premature failure of parts, leaks, cracks, splits of a lot of components, and ultimately mean huge dollars out of your pockets. Simply by checking and making sure you change your coolant every 5 years or 50,000 miles, or even before that, to ensure that you're keeping your fluid in good shape, that you're going to optimize your cooling, that you're going to minimize repairs for the future. Water pumps, whether it be electric water pumps, are very expensive these days with plastic housings. They are far less tolerant to abuse and neglect. So you've got to change your cooling system fluid at regular intervals. And that's something a lot of people just forget to do. They believe that I'll do a flush when the actual water pump fails or a thermostat fails. That's when they were going to actually change it. But in most cases, by then it's simply too late. If you're starting to see equipment and component failure in the cooling system, like a water pump, that's usually an indication that you've got a contamination, corrosion, and possibly older coolant that should have been changed tens of thousands of miles earlier. Modern day automatic transmissions are very nice to operate. They are far more reliable than they used to be, and even the fluids in them are far better with the advanced technology in fluids as well as the technology in the transmissions themselves. Many of them can last tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of miles. But unfortunately, contrary to what a lot of vendors are saying, that they say it's a lifetime fluid, the reality is if you change the fluids throughout the lifetime, which means generally doing a drain and a fill and a drain and a fill, and you do that every so often at irregular intervals, you're likely to extend the life of that automatic transmission. The same thing goes with continuously variable transmissions. One major mode of failure is the fact that people fail to do a lot of the fluid changes. DCT transmissions, as well as manual transmissions, is a simpler system, of course, with gear oil, but also should be looked at and considered, because doing those fluid changes often extends the life of your transmission. But the unfortunate part is, if you buy an older car, there is an exception to this rule. Maybe you find yourself a car, you go on the Trader, you find this car, maybe it has, 220,000 miles, it seems to run okay, and then all of a sudden you start to believe that maybe you should change the automatic transmission fluid. That's where you would be absolutely wrong, because if it's been neglected for many, many years and all of a sudden you go and you want to do a flush, that's where you can subject the vehicle to a major catastrophic transmission failure. And you can find that soon after you did a flush on that automatic transmission with 300,000 miles on it, all of a sudden it's slipping, juddering, or catastrophic failure, because there's all this varnish and metallic particulates in there that start to circulate and plug off orifices and plug off clutches, and absolutely will cause a failure. So if you start to take care of your transmission early on and do it religiously, it will last. If you don't do that, or if you find a car with higher mileage, you're almost better off just either be careful, do just a simple drain and fill, or even just don't bother at all by that time and hope for the best. Another habit you really need to get into, and a lot of people tend to neglect them. Now, this vehicle has a timing chain, and you really should understand the vehicle you're owning and driving and whether it has a timing chain or a timing belt. Now, most manufacturers are going to say timing chains are good for the life of the engine. Always worth to consider. A rattly startup could indicate a bad slack timing chain, and something which should be inspected as soon as physically possible. But it's changing of the timing belts, whether you're driving some of the Honda products that have timing belts, or a lot of other vehicle manufacturers, Nissan and beyond, still use timing belts. Never skip a timing belt change. Check your owner's directions on that. Understand what you need to do for servicing on those services, and be sure to check it and change it as soon as physically possible. 60,000 miles for some vehicles. Many vehicles like some Hondas are over 100,000 miles, but suffice it to say, never skip your timing belt change, because if you do, you could potentially have a piston and a valve connection slammed together, and it ultimately means a sudden stopping of the engine, catastrophic failure, safety issue out driving around, and more importantly, thousands of dollars, because now you have to replace the engine. Another habit you want to get into, if you want to keep your vehicle lasting a long time, you want to keep the shine on your car, you want to keep it on the road a long time, because a vehicle that is neglected and you let it rust and rot, you can quickly accelerate that vehicle into the dumpster or into the crusher, because a lot of times they become unsafe, and in some countries and some jurisdictions they actually mandate that vehicle is going to have to be taken off the road if it has too much corrosion. That unfortunately can cost you huge money in the end if you have to replace your vehicle in short order. However, if you clean your vehicle regularly, not just the paint and not just washing this, and a lot of people I notice wash the wheels and they wash up here, but they neglect to wash down here, or they forget to even bother washing in the undercarriage, which is one of the most important areas to wash. That in fact will start to rot from the inside out, and then before you know it, looks good from the outside, but it starts rusting from the inside out, and unfortunately starts to accelerate the deterioration of that vehicle. So washing the undercarriage of the vehicle is almost more important than washing the fenders or the top or the roof, because that's the area that collects dirt, gets neglected, never gets seen, and unfortunately will quickly move that corrosion upwards into a hidden spot that you can't even see. So be sure to clean underneath the vehicle and the lower areas, and they're extremely important to do so. Modern day engines run very, very efficiently, and they need everything working perfectly. Perfect airflow, perfect fueling, and of course perfect spark, because spark is what ignites the fuel and air mixture, and without a proper spark, that vehicle's not going to run properly. So if all of a sudden you find your vehicle maybe shaking at idle, maybe it's a delay, a hesitation on acceleration, maybe it's just using more fuel lately, maybe it just doesn't seem to have the performance at the top end or at the bottom end, or there's a little bit of a stutter when you're taking off, that could be a sign of a bad spark plug. And ultimately, spark plugs are something you want to change very regularly. Definitely, at the bare minimum, follow the manufacturer's instructions on spark plug replacements, because that is a factor in modern day engines that are using directed fuel injection. And of course, iridium spark plugs are great. That's why they're using better technology and spark plugs these days, because vehicles need that level of precision and performance. So always be sure to change those spark plugs at the regular prescribed mileage. Another habit you want to get into, again, that people often neglect, is if you have a vehicle like this, whether it's a rear-wheel drive vehicle, if it's a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you have an engine like this, it puts power down through the transmission and runs to a rear differential. Differential now is a place where it transfers that torque from the drive shaft to the wheels through a differential. The differential is a set of gears. You've got to change that fluid regularly. Also, transfer case. So there's a transfer case in most vehicles that are all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. The transfer case is yet another area that transfers that torque from the engine, transmission, through the transfer case, and distributes the torque accordingly, either through the front, the rear, or combination of wheels to get that power to the ground. There's fluid in the transfer case or rear differential. You've got to change those fluids, and if you don't, you will, in short order, start to get noise, howling, juddering, and poor driving conditions all the way around. And unfortunately, to replace a modern day transfer case or even a modern day rear differential could cost you upwards $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for any of those in some of the more premium models. And even a low-end brand, you can still find yourself having to dish out $1,000 or $2,000 to replace some of those critical components. So it's imperative that you change your transfer case fluids as well as your rear differential. Do it as prescribed ownership directions, but ultimately, at a bare minimum, do it more frequently if you like, but that's something that often gets neglected. With all of that said, there's always a few duds. You're definitely going to want to check out that video, some of the worst engines possibly on the market today. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. See you real soon. Bye-bye.